Hollywood, 1939. Charlie Chaplin sat alone in a dark screening room. What he was about to do would either save lives or end his career. The footage flickering on the screen wasn't a comedy. It was a newsreel from Germany. Thousands of soldiers marching in perfect synchronization, flags bearing twisted crosses, and at the center of it all, a small man with a strange mustache, raising his arm to the sky while millions cheered. Chaplin leaned forward in his seat. His cigarette had burned down to his fingers, but he didn't notice. He was too busy studying the man on the screen. The way he moved, the way he gestured, the theatrical fury in his speeches. And then, something unexpected happened. Charlie Chaplin began to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because he had just realized something that no one else had seen. This dictator, this monster who was terrorizing Europe, was performing. He was playing a role, and if there was one thing Chaplin understood better than anyone else on Earth, it was performance. "I can destroy him," Chaplin whispered to the empty room. Not with guns, not with armies, with laughter. But what Chaplin didn't know that night would haunt him for the rest of his life. The man he was about to mock was capable of horrors beyond imagination. And by the time Chaplin learned the full truth, it would be too late. This is the story of the most dangerous film ever made. The year was 1938 when the idea first took root. Europe was holding its breath. Adolf Hitler had already annexed Austria. His armies were massing on the borders of Czechoslovakia. The word war hung in the air like smoke before a fire. In Hollywood, most studio executives wanted nothing to do with politics. Films were escapism, entertainment. Nobody wanted to anger the German market, which was still buying American movies. The unspoken rule was simple. Don't mention Hitler, don't mention the Nazis, and definitely don't make them look foolish. But Charlie Chaplin had never been good at following rules. The idea came to him like a bolt of lightning. He and Hitler shared something strange, something that felt almost like fate. They were born 4 days apart. Chaplin on April 16th, 1889. Hitler on April 20th, 1889. Two babies entering the world in the same week, destined to become the most recognized faces on the planet. One would make the world laugh. The other would make it burn. And there was something else. Something that made Chaplin's blood run cold every time he looked in the mirror. The mustache. That small, rectangular patch of hair beneath the nose that had become Chaplin's signature as the Little Tramp. Hitler wore the exact same style. Some historians would later claim that Hitler had copied Chaplin deliberately, hoping to absorb some of the comedian's universal appeal. Others said it was coincidence, but Chaplin saw it as something else entirely. It was an insult. This tyrant had stolen his face, his identity, and now Chaplin would steal it back. The screenplay took him over a year to write. Chaplin locked himself in his study at his Beverly Hills mansion, surrounded by newspapers and newsreels. He studied Hitler obsessively, the way the dictator's hands trembled when he spoke, the way his voice rose to a shriek and then dropped to a whisper, the way he seemed to hypnotize crowds with pure theatrical rage. "He's not a politician," Chaplin told his brother Sidney. "He's a performer, a bad one, and I'm going to show the world exactly how ridiculous he is." The film would be called The Great Dictator. Chaplin would play two roles: Adenoid Hinkle, the buffoonish dictator of Tamania, and a humble Jewish barber who happens to look exactly like him. It would be satire wrapped in comedy, wrapped in a desperate plea for humanity. But there was one problem, a problem that kept Chaplin awake at night, staring at his ceiling in the darkness. He had never spoken on film. For 20 years, Charlie Chaplin had been the master of silence. While every other filmmaker in Hollywood had embraced sound, Chaplin had stubbornly refused. His character, the Little Tramp, communicated through movement, through expression, through the universal language of physical comedy. But how do you mock a dictator's speeches without words? How do you expose the absurdity of Nazi rhetoric through pantomime alone? The answer was terrifying in its simplicity. He would have to speak. After 2 decades of silence, Charlie Chaplin would finally open his mouth. And when he did, he would deliver the most important speech of his life. Production began in September 1939. The timing could not have been worse or more perfect. On September 1st, Hitler's armies invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world had officially descended into madness. In Hollywood, panic spread through the studio system. The German market was now completely closed. But more than that, there was genuine fear. What if Hitler won? What if the Nazis came to America? Anyone who had publicly opposed the regime might find themselves on a very dangerous list. United Artists, the studio Chaplin had co-founded, begged him to cancel the production. "Charlie, this is suicide," one executive pleaded. "You're painting a target on your back." Chaplin's response was calm, measured, and absolutely final. "Good. Let them aim at me instead of someone who can't fight back." The threat started almost immediately. Anonymous letters arrived at the studio. Some promised boycotts, others promised violence. The German consulate in Los Angeles filed formal complaints. American Nazi sympathizers, and there were more of them than history likes to remember, organized protests outside the studio gates. Inside the soundstage, Chaplin worked like a man possessed. He designed every set himself. He choreographed every scene. He composed the musical score. He rewrote dialogue dozens of times, searching for the perfect balance between comedy and message. The most famous scene in the film, one that would be studied in film schools for the next century, came to him in a dream. Hinkle, the dictator, alone in his office with a large inflatable globe. He dances with it, bouncing it off his hands, his head, his backside. He is playing with the world like a child plays with a balloon. The joy on his face is pure, innocent, almost beautiful. And then the globe pops. Hinkle's face crumbles. For a moment, he looks like he might cry. Then the rage returns, and he storms off to plan his next conquest. It was comedy. It was tragedy. It was everything Chaplin had spent his life learning to create. But the scene that would truly change history came at the very end. Chaplin had written and rewritten the final speech dozens of times. It wasn't supposed to be there at all. The original ending had the Jewish barber, mistaken for Hinkle, simply walking away while a crowd cheered. Fade to black. Credits. But Chaplin couldn't let it end that way. "I have to say something," he told his assistant director. "The world is falling apart. People are dying. If I have a platform, if millions of people are going to watch this film, I have a responsibility to use it." "But Charlie," the assistant argued, "it breaks every rule of cinema. Characters don't just turn to the camera and deliver political speeches. The audience will feel cheated." Chaplin looked at him with those sad, expressive eyes that had moved millions without ever speaking a word. "Then let them feel cheated. Some things are more important than rules." The speech ran 6 minutes. 6 minutes of Charlie Chaplin, dressed as a Jewish barber who has accidentally become a dictator, looking directly into the camera and pleading with humanity to choose love over hate, compassion over cruelty, democracy over tyranny. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white." The words poured out of him. 20 years of silence, finally broken. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. His voice cracked with emotion. This wasn't acting anymore. This was Charlie Chaplin himself, the boy from the London slums, the man who had been chased by poverty and persecution his entire life, begging the world to wake up before it was too late. The hate of men will pass and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people, and so long as men die, liberty will never perish. When he finished, there was complete silence on the set. The cameramen had tears in their eyes. The crew stood frozen. Nobody knew what to say. Finally, Chaplin lowered his head, suddenly looking very small, very tired, very human. "Cut," he whispered. "I think we got it." The Great Dictator premiered on October 15th, 1940. The response was explosive, in every direction. Critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece, a brave and necessary work of art. Others called it preachy, self-indulgent, a comedian overstepping his bounds. The American Nazi organization condemned it as Jewish propaganda. The Catholic Legion of Decency warned audiences to stay away. In Britain, the film was initially banned because the government feared it might offend Hitler during a crucial period of the war. But audiences didn't care about critics or politics or controversy. They lined up around the block. In New York, the theater had to add extra screenings. In Chicago, people waited for hours in the rain. Across America, people who had never heard Hitler speak suddenly understood exactly how ridiculous he was. And they laughed. They laughed at his pompous gestures. They laughed at his invented language of Germanic-sounding gibberish. They laughed at his pathetic attempts to assert dominance through volume and fury. For the first time, Hitler wasn't scary. He was absurd. But across the Atlantic, one man wasn't laughing. Reports vary on whether Adolf Hitler actually watched The Great Dictator. Some historians claim he obtained a private copy and screened it twice. Others say he refused to acknowledge the film's existence. What we know for certain is this. The Nazi propaganda ministry was deeply alarmed. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, wrote in his diary about the dangerous Jewish comedian who was undermining the Reich's image abroad. Internal memos discussed possible responses, counter-propaganda, assassination attempts, efforts to have Chaplin arrested if he ever set foot in occupied territory. The Nazis understood something that many in Hollywood had missed. Laughter is a weapon. It strips away fear. It exposes the machinery of power. It reminds people that tyrants are just men, small, insecure, desperate men hiding behind uniforms and flags. Hitler had spent years building a mythology of invincibility. In 90 minutes, Charlie Chaplin had punched a hole through it. The war raged on for 5 more years. Chaplin threw himself into the war effort. He gave speeches. He sold war bonds. He publicly demanded that America and Britain open a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, a stance that would later be used against him during the McCarthy era. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world began to learn the full scope of Nazi atrocities. The concentration camps, the gas chambers. 6 million Jews systematically murdered in the most horrific genocide in human history. Chaplin received the news at his home in Beverly Hills. He sat in his study for hours, unable to speak, unable to move. The newspapers were spread across his desk. Photographs of skeletal survivors, mass graves, the industrial machinery of death. He thought about his film, the comedy, the satire, the moments when he had made audiences laugh at Hitler's buffoonery. Had he done the right thing? Or had he trivialized something that should never have been trivialized? Years later, Chaplin would give his answer. Had I known of the actual horrors of the German concentration camps, I could not have made The Great Dictator. I could not have made fun of the homicidal insanity of the Nazis. The statement would follow him for the rest of his life. Some saw it as genuine remorse, a humanitarian who realized the limits of comedy in the face of absolute evil. Others saw it as false modesty, knowing that his film had done more to undermine Nazi mythology than 1,000 serious documentaries. But perhaps the truth was simpler than either interpretation. Charlie Chaplin had done what he always did. He had looked at the world's pain and tried to transform it into something bearable. He had used the only weapon he had, laughter, to fight the only way he knew how. Was it enough? Could anything ever be enough? The answer, like so many things in Chaplin's life, remained suspended between tragedy and comedy. The aftermath of The Great Dictator shaped the rest of Chaplin's career, and ultimately led to his exile from the country he had called home for 40 years. The FBI had been watching Chaplin since the 1920s, but the war years intensified their surveillance. J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau's obsessive director, became convinced that Chaplin was a communist sympathizer. The evidence? His calls for a second front to help the Soviet Union. His refusal to become an American citizen. His friendships with left-leaning artists and intellectuals. The file on Chaplin eventually grew to over 1,900 pages. When the McCarthy era arrived in the late 1940s, Chaplin became a target. He was accused of un-American activities. He was called a communist, a subversive, a threat to national security. The same man who had risked everything to mock Hitler was now being treated as an enemy of the state. In 1952, Chaplin sailed to London for the premiere of his new film, Limelight. While he was at sea, Attorney General James P. McGranary revoked his re-entry permit. Chaplin was not allowed to return to America. The message was clear. The nation that had made him the most famous man in the world no longer wanted him. Chaplin never went back. He settled in Switzerland with his wife Una and their children. He lived in a beautiful mansion overlooking Lake Geneva. He continued to make films. He wrote his autobiography. He accepted honors from around the world, but he never forgot what America had done to him. 20 years later, Hollywood came crawling back. In 1972, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences invited Chaplin to return to America for a special honorary Oscar. After decades of silence, they wanted to celebrate the man they had once abandoned. Chaplin was 82 years old. He was frail. He could barely walk without assistance. His doctors advised against the trip. He went anyway. On April 10, 1972, Charlie Chaplin stepped onto the stage of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles. The audience rose to their feet. They began to applaud, and they kept applauding. For 12 minutes, the standing ovation continued. Tears streamed down the faces of actors and directors who had grown up watching his films. The applause became something more than appreciation. It became an apology. Chaplin stood at the podium, his eyes glistening, his hands trembling. He tried to speak several times but couldn't. The emotion was too overwhelming. Finally, he managed a few words. "Thank you. This is a very emotional moment for me, and words seem so futile, so feeble." The audience applauded again. Some were openly sobbing. Here was the man who had dared to laugh at Hitler, the man who had used comedy as a weapon against tyranny, the man who had been rewarded for his courage with exile and persecution. And now at the end of his life, he was finally being welcomed home. Charlie Chaplin died on Christmas Day 1977. He was 88 years old. He passed peacefully in his sleep at his home in Switzerland, surrounded by his family. The little boy who had eaten candles to survive in a London workhouse had become one of the most influential artists in human history. His legacy remains complicated, as all great legacies must be. The Great Dictator is still studied in film schools. The final speech is still quoted in political movements around the world. The image of Hinkle playing with his globe has become one of cinema's most enduring metaphors for the absurdity of power. But Chaplin's own doubts have also survived. His admission that he could not have made the film if he had known the full truth raises questions that every artist must eventually face. What are the limits of satire? When does comedy become inappropriate? Can laughter heal wounds, or does it sometimes make them worse? There are no easy answers. What we know is this. In 1940, when the world was falling into darkness, one small man with a ridiculous mustache decided to fight back. He didn't have an army. He didn't have political power. He had only a camera, a script, and the conviction that laughter could penetrate walls that bullets could not. He was right. Decades after the Nazis fell, decades after the concentration camps were liberated, decades after Hitler put a gun to his head in a Berlin bunker, people still watch The Great Dictator. They still laugh at Hinkle's buffoonery. They still cry during the final speech. And somewhere, in some eternal screening room beyond the stars, Charlie Chaplin is still there. Still watching, still believing that comedy is the highest form of courage. The dictators die. The laughter lives forever.